The call I made from that hospital bed was supposed to be the easiest one of my life. I was 31 years old, I had just had an emergency C-section that nearly killed me, and all I needed was for my parents to get on a plane from Calgary to Toronto and help me with their grandson for a few weeks. That was it. That was the whole ask. My mother picked up on the second ring. I could hear the television in the background. Some home renovation show they never missed. I told her what had happened, the surgery, the blood loss, the 3 days in intensive care while my son lay in the NICU, and when I finished speaking, there was a long pause. "That sounds really hard, sweetheart," she said, "but you know January flights are so expensive. And your father's knee has been acting up." I stared at the ceiling tiles of my hospital room for a long time after she hung up. My son was born on a Tuesday in the middle of a Toronto snowstorm. He came 6 weeks early and not the way anyone had planned. One moment I was in a routine appointment, and the next my blood pressure had spiked so high that everything moved in fast forward. A wheelchair, a consent form pressed into my hand, bright surgical lights, and then darkness. When I woke up, a nurse was telling me my boy had arrived safely, that he was small but strong, and that the next few weeks would require patience. I didn't hear much after safely, I just cried. My husband Gavin was there, sitting by the window with his phone face down in his lap. He smiled when I opened my eyes, but the smile didn't reach anywhere. He held my hand and said the right things, but something about the way he kept glancing down at the screen made the relief in my chest feel incomplete. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had just survived something frightening. Everything was going to feel off for a while. But my parents' refusal sat with me differently. I replayed my mother's voice in the hours that followed, the slight hesitation before she spoke, the way she had mentioned the cost of flights before she had even asked how I was feeling. My parents were not struggling. My father had retired comfortably from a contracting business. They had taken 2 vacations the previous summer. The idea that a flight from Calgary was financially impossible, while their daughter lay in a hospital recovering from major surgery, did not add up. I filed it away because I had no energy to examine it, and I turned back toward my son. Gavin's visits grew shorter as the days passed. He cited the commute from our condo in Scarborough, the demands of work, the idea that I needed rest more than company. Every excuse was reasonable on its surface, and I did not have the strength to push back. I was learning how to feed my son through a tiny tube because he had not yet developed the strength to nurse on his own, and most of my attention lived there. It was on the 5th day that I noticed the notification. My phone and Gavin's shared an account for our home banking app, something we had set up years earlier for convenience. An alert appeared while I was checking an automatic bill payment, a flag on unusual account activity. $62,000 had been transferred out of our joint savings account 4 days before my delivery, the day before my appointment, the day before everything came apart. I sat very still. My son slept in his warming bassinet beside me. The machines beeped quietly. I read the notification 3 times. When Gavin arrived that evening, I asked him about it calmly. He turned the color of the hospital walls. He said it was a business investment. He said he had meant to tell me, but timing had been difficult. He said a great deal, very quickly, none of which explained why $62,000 had left our account without my knowledge or signature 4 days before I nearly died on an operating table. I asked him to leave. He did. That night I started making calls. The bank's fraud line, our mortgage broker, a real estate lawyer whose number I found through my workplace's employee assistance program. What I pieced together over the following 48 hours did not simply break my heart. It rearranged everything I believed I knew about my own life. The savings account was not the only account that had been touched. There was a home equity line of credit registered against our condo, a HELOC I had never agreed to, bearing a signature that was supposed to be mine but was not. Someone had forged my name on the application documents. Based on the broker's records, this had happened 14 months earlier. 14 months of interest charges accumulating on a line of credit I had never known existed, secured against the home I believed we owned outright. The amount drawn on that HELOC was $87,000. I called my parents that night. I told my mother what I had found. I needed someone to confirm that I was not losing my mind, that what I was reading was as serious as it felt. "I'm sure there's an explanation," she said. "Gavin is a smart man, he knows what he's doing." "Mom, someone forged my signature on a legal document." "You've just had major surgery," she said quietly. "You're not sleeping properly. Please don't make any decisions right now." She suggested I speak with Gavin before involving anyone else. She said families went through rough patches. She said I should think about what this would do to my son, growing up without his father in the home. My father called the following morning. His tone was different from my mother's, less soothing, more careful. He told me that he and my mother had already spoken with Gavin, that they understood the situation, that things were complicated, and I needed to trust the people around me. When I asked what Gavin had told them, he went quiet. When I pressed, he shifted the conversation to my recovery and whether I was eating enough. My parents had spoken with my husband before they had called to check on me. I spent the rest of that morning staring at the gray January sky outside my window, trying to locate the version of my family that made sense. The version where they got on a plane when their daughter nearly died. The version where they told me to report a forged signature instead of asking me to protect the man who forged it. That version did not seem to exist. 2 days later, I was transferred from intensive care to a regular ward. I was holding my son during one of those long afternoon visits, his tiny fist wrapped around my finger, when I heard voices outside the door to my room. My parents had come to Toronto, not from Calgary. They had apparently been staying at our condo with Gavin for the past 3 days. I had not known they were in the city. Their voices were low, but the door was ajar. They were not arguing, they were coordinating. I caught pieces of it. My mother mentioning a documents, my father saying Gavin needed more time, and then my mother's voice, sharper than usual. If she reports this, the money stops. You understand that? All of it stops. I placed my son carefully back in his bassinet and sat with that sentence for a very long time. The transfers I uncovered later, through details the financial crimes investigator eventually shared, were smaller than what Gavin had taken from our accounts, but they were steady. $2,000 a month, sent to my parents' joint account, every month for the past 2 years. There were no loan agreements, no repayment schedules, just regular transfers, consistent as rent, from our household finances into theirs. My parents had not refused to come, because January flights were expensive, or because my father's knee was troublesome. They had refused because the man sending them money every month needed them to stay quiet, and they had decided that was a reasonable trade. I was still sitting with that knowledge when the door opened and someone I had not expected walked in. She was in her late 70s, small and sharp-eyed, moving carefully but with clear intention. She wore a wool coat the color of winter bark and carried a large handbag against her side. I recognized her from old photographs, my father's aunt, the one the family had quietly stopped mentioning when I was a teenager. The one they described as difficult, paranoid, someone who had never learned to let old grievances go. She sat down without being invited, set her handbag on her lap, and said, "I heard what happened to you. I came as soon as I could arrange a flight." She had driven from Pearson Airport directly to the hospital without calling ahead. She had simply come. We talked for a long time that afternoon. She told me she had been pushed out of our family for one reason. She had once confronted my father about money that went missing during the settlement of my grandfather's estate, a property sold without my grandfather's knowledge in his final months, while he was confined to a care home in Edmonton. She had asked questions my father could not answer. She had refused to sign a release form she had not reviewed, and slowly, over the months that followed, she had found herself uninvited to dinners, uncalled on holidays, and eventually treated as though she simply did not exist. She told me she had never stopped paying attention, that when someone showed you who they were through paperwork, you kept the paperwork. She placed a manila envelope on the bedside table. Inside were decades of carefully preserved records, correspondence between my father and his accountant, a property transfer that had never appeared on the estate documents, notes from a lawyer she had consulted at the time, who had confirmed her concerns but explained that pursuing the matter would be expensive and difficult, voicemail transcripts she had typed out by hand because she had not known any other way to preserve them. She had kept all of it, every letter, every receipt, every document in chronological order inside archival sleeves. "I'm not telling you this to cause pain," she said. "I'm telling you so you understand what you're dealing with. This is not new behavior." I looked at the documents spread across my lap, and then at my son asleep in his bassinet, and something shifted inside me. Not rage, something quieter and more durable. The feeling that I had spent 31 years trying to earn something that was never actually being offered, and that it was time to stop reaching for it. My great-aunt stayed in Toronto. She found a short-term rental near the hospital and visited every day, bringing food she had cooked in the small rental kitchen, sitting beside me during calls with lawyers, holding my son while I rested. She had raised children of her own and her hands were steady and sure. She knew how to handle a fragile, early-arrived baby, and she did it without being asked and without needing to be thanked. I retained a family law solicitor who referred me to a financial crimes consultant. The HELOC documents went to the Toronto Police Service Financial Crimes Unit. A handwriting analyst confirmed within 3 weeks what I already knew. The signature on the application was not mine. Gavin was placed under investigation. He had been gambling, not at a casino but through offshore betting platforms that left a detailed electronic trail. The HELOC proceeds had covered his losses. The savings withdrawal was meant to cover more before the whole structure collapsed. My parents called twice during that period. Both conversations ended the same way, with them asking me to reconsider, to think about the family, to speak with Gavin before doing anything that could not be undone. I began letting the calls go to voicemail. My brother reached out separately. He had been living in Vancouver for years and we were not close, but he had heard through distant relatives that something was happening. Unlike our parents, he did not ask me to stand down. He asked if there was anything he could do. The conversation was halting and full of the awkwardness that accumulates over years of distance, but it was honest, and that mattered more than smoothness. He told me that he had moved to Vancouver partly to escape the weight of a family that managed everything quietly and required your silence as the price of belonging. He said it had taken him a long time to name that for what it was. We started talking more regularly. Slowly, carefully, we began filling in the gaps between us. The legal process moved at the pace. Legal processes always move. Not fast enough but steadily. There was a separation agreement to negotiate alongside the fraud investigation. The HELOC required civil proceedings separate from the criminal matter. There were days when the paperwork seemed designed specifically to exhaust whoever was trying to be held accountable through it. On those days my great-aunt would make tea and sit across the table from me, and we would go through the documents together. She had a precise mind and no patience for anything vague. She pushed me to ask questions I was afraid to ask. She reminded me, more than once, that people who rely on deception count on your exhaustion to protect them. She was right. The criminal fraud case against Gavin proceeded through the Ontario courts. He entered a guilty plea in connection with the forged HELOC documents. The civil settlement returned a portion of what had been taken, though not all. Some of the money was simply gone. I retained the condo after the mortgage adjustments, and I retained my son. My parents and I did not repair things. There were no dramatic confrontations. What there was instead was a long silence that gradually became the shape of what we were to each other. My great-aunt's health began declining the following winter. She had known for some time that her heart was weakening. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, directly and without sentiment, as a fact to be accounted for rather than avoided. On a February afternoon, exactly 13 months after she had walked through my hospital room door, with an envelope and a wool coat the color of bark, I sat beside her bed in the palliative unit at Sunnybrook and held her hand while she looked at photographs of my son on my phone. She studied each one carefully, then she looked at me. "You didn't flinch," she said. That was the part I was watching for. A lot of people flinch when the truth costs something. She passed away 3 days later, quietly, in the early morning. I did not try to manage the grief. I had known her for barely a year, and I missed her more than I had language for. I understood, in the weeks after she died, what she had been to me. Not a replacement for the family I had lost, but a proof that the thing I had been looking for actually existed. That it was possible to be seen clearly, to be known completely, and still be chosen, still be worth showing up for. I planted a container garden on my balcony that spring. Herbs mostly, practical things, the kind she would have approved of. My son stood at the sliding glass door and watched the pigeons on the railing with an expression of tremendous seriousness, and I sat with my coffee while he napped and listened to the neighborhood wake up around us. I had stopped reaching for approval from people who had decided I was not worth the flight. I had a son with curious eyes and opinions about pigeons. I had a brother in Vancouver who texted me every Sunday. I had the memory of a woman who had heard what happened to me and driven directly from the airport to my hospital room, because for her, that was simply what you did. The future, when I let myself look at it, was smaller than I had planned. And it was entirely mine.